Look, I can explain. I'm sorry.
I need to see you. Meet me in Fuller's office.
I know the truth.
Where are you?
You could call it the end of the world. How many simulated worlds like this are there?
Thousands. But yours is the only one that ever created a simulation within the simulation. Something that we never could have expected.
I stabbed him.
But it wasn't you. It was your user. He downloaded into you, manipulated you.
Like a puppet.
A puppet doesn't have a soul.
I can't have a soul any more than Fuller.
But you do. Fuller did. That's what I never expected. We programmed this world so that no one in it could ever learn the truth, and you and Fuller did. Don't you see what that means?
Yeah. There's just one little flaw in your thesis. None of this is real. You pull the plug. I disappear. And nothing I ever say, nothing I ever do, will ever matter. Why don't you find my user? I'm sure he's a much better catch.
That was from the underrated The 13th Floor, part of the delicious eruption of Gnostic films in the late 90s that included The Matrix, The Truman Show, Fight Club, Existence, Dark City, and so many others. This manic art expression for awakening was fueled by the Gen X fury of the early 90s. A roar of rebellion against the lethe venom and psyche-numbing hadiths of the 70s and 80s. Culminating with the Archon ejaculation that was the first Persian War and Pedo Bush's call for a new world order. And that Gen X fury, that Promethean mutiny, manifested as well in the form of grunge and the golden era of hip-hop, The Simpsons and South Park and The X-Files and so much more.
Mulder, the truth is out there, but so are lies.
We were defibrillating our minds, and we were exploring our dark souls, and we were cynical, and we were politically incorrect, and we were breaking down every societal illusion piece by piece.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
Even I was doing it in the late 90s. Overcoming being a junkie and hypocrite Christian, broken by a novel I wrote, Stargazer from Warner Books, that became prophetical and transformed me into a vampire like in the plot. And around me and through me, the cosmic but grinding awakening was happening. And right at 2000, I did awaken and became a Buddhist. A very counterculture one, sober and joining that Gen X Gnostic awakening.
Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
But that wickedness in high places wouldn't have it. So the rulers of this age crafted the most powerful mass ritual in history. 9/11. Oh, that disgusting human sacrifice. And it worked, placing Western humanity once again in a state of sleep, drunkenness, and forgetfulness. Enter perpetual wars and the Patriot Act and big testicle materialism and social networks and me becoming a neocon and so much cultural polarization. And the Second Gulf War, and 2012, when an older ritual brought Yaldabaoth fully into our dimension.
You gotta tell them Silent Breed is people!
Maybe I'm just delusional and everything is just hunky-dory. Right, Courtney Love? Or maybe I'm myth-making to find hidden insights and overlook collective sins that need to be addressed. After all, myth is the history of meaning, that public dream, that avenue into the renewing energies of the world of archetypes. As Jungian expert June Singer wrote in A Gnostic Book of Hours, myths are a true expression of our inner selves, revealed cryptically in image, symbol, and metaphor. They are something like dreams. Rationally, they may not ring true, but in a psychological sense, they express people's inner processes through the use of ingenious devices that conceal what must be concealed and reveal what must be revealed.
So myths are stories of the search by men and women through the ages for meaning, for significance, to make life signify, to touch the eternal, to understand the mysterious, to find out who we are.
Or maybe I'm being literal as I write my own gospel and live my own myth. And like Stargazer, it has become prophetic and even a custom-made Mandela effect. I like what Nate, the occult fan, wrote the other day. He said, "Just waiting till the Mandela affects itself."
Hell, I like you. You can come over to my house and fuck my sister.
Regardless, does it matter? It's 2019, and we're near the extinction of the human imagination. And we need an inner life, an exterior Gen X rebellion more than ever. Are you listening, Gen Z? I mean, I got 99 problems, and being trapped in a decaying body, in a money-hungry society, on a dying planet, in a mysterious dimension might be one.
Birth is a curse and existence is a prison.
But glad you're here with me on Aeon Gnostic Radio, because you are amazing, and you are beautiful, and you are a creator of so many wonders. Your own myth maker and writer of the best possible gospel. Oh, so glad you're here with me, Miguel Connor. No longer identifying with Abraxas and not wanting to explain why, but I'll get to it. Still in his meat sack incarnation, no longer broadcasting from the Laughlin frigid dystopia of Chicago, teeming with Mothmen, but presently in the Illinois countryside, near a town called Wakanda, and near a town called Woodstock, where they filmed the movie Groundhog Day. Near deer and coyotes and marshland frogs that Jung said were the servants of Abraxas in his 7 sermons to the dead. All true, I think, but also myth-making, for there is wonder everywhere, and there is myth-making where you are right now. Even as we recover from that tragic mass magic ritual that was 9/11. Like the Gnostic-minded Jorge Luis Borges wrote, "We are a careless or criminal blunder, the fruit of engagement of the flawed deity and crude material."
God isn't for you, Lenny. God is for men who have no use for freedom.
By Melek Dow's The Peacock Angel. I told myself I'd do a dry and direct intro, a shorter one. June and July were taxing by issues many of you know now from the Inner Sanctum group and the Discord channel. Magnified by Saturn retrograde and Mercury retrograde. Death and child health issues and other of those 99 problems were sent to me by the pinche arcontes. But I think the content was liberating, and I have given it my soul, literally and figuratively. And together we must continue to break down the Black Iron Prison. In the spirit of the late 90s, when those wonderful Gnostic movies ended the millennium, and before Yaldi Baldi pushed back. We must, and I shall continue if you're here with me.
Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women. That is good. That is good.
As we create myth, we see how all history is fiction. And we know this. And on this August, the year of our damn year 2019, the virtual Alexandria hosts an incredible researcher that has spent decades uncovering the truth. The real truth about such topics as Montauk, Jack Parsons, Aleister Crowley, L. Ron Hubbard, the Philadelphia experiment, and how they are all connected and still affect us today. And that guest is the brilliant Peter Moon, author of dozens of eye-opening works like The Black Moon, The Montauk Project, Mystery of Egypt, and The Music of Time. And yes, we'll be discussing in this Eternal Now Montauk, Jack Parsons, Aleister Crowley, L. Ron Hubbard, the Philadelphia experiment, and how they're all connected and affect us today. And much more, including how you are connected to all of this, and how there have been more dark rituals beyond 9/11 to keep humanity asleep.
It's the unspoken truth of humanity that you crave subjugation. The bright lure of freedom diminishes your life's joy in a mad scramble for power, for identity. You were made to be ruled. In the end, you will always kneel.
Glad Peter's research is here, and he's done what he's done as an appreciated truth seeker warrior. Again, so happy you're here, and you are you. Breaking down the Black Iron Prison. Myth-making to awaken your inner Billy Jack self for that Promethean mutiny. As Joseph Campbell wrote, it would not be too much to say that myth is the secret opening through which the inexhaustible energies of the cosmos pour into human cultural manifestation. Religion, philosophies, arts, the social forms of primitive and historic man, prime discoveries in science and technology, the very dreams that blister sleep, boil up from the basic magic ring of myth.
Myths are clues to the spiritual potentialities of the human life.
What we're capable of knowing within?
Yes.
Divided we stand, together we rise. United we myth make, and I'm just Miguel Connor in the Illinois countryside. And you know what I want sometimes more than anything? The power to teach raccoons, squirrels, opossums, and deer how to cross the damn road. That would be awesome. The universe, it seems, is just one eternal highway of the gods with so much roadkill. So much roadkill. So much of it. Except for that chicken-headed being Abraxas who crosses every road. Maybe I should ask him, but he's probably just a myth. Led us to the incredible interview with the incredible Peter Moon. Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just is.
While I am standing still, I prefer the stillness here. I am tired of Earth, these people. I'm tired of being caught in the tangle of their lives. They claim their labors are to build a heaven, Yet their heaven is populated with horrors. Perhaps the world is not made. Perhaps nothing is made. A clock without a craftsman. It's too late. Always has been. Always will be. Too late.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we have the pleasure of being joined by Peter Moon. How are you doing, Peter? Thanks for being on the show.
I'm good today, thanks. Nice to be with you.
The pleasure is all ours. And with us, we also have a moon, but this is actually the Moon Dog Vance. How you doing, Vance?
Well, I'm looking forward to a very interesting romp through the many esoteric subjects that Peter is familiar with.
Yes, indeed. I mean, Peter, you are very prolific. You've been doing excellent research before it was even, you might say, trendy, especially in today's hyperactive conspiracy culture. But as we talked before, we better start from the beginning. And yourself, I was curious, when did you decide, or when did you realize that the official narrative of history was less than true? Was it sort of a road to Damascus experience, or sort of a slow burn? I mean, I can say, like many people, with me, it was the Kennedy assassination, reading it in my 20s, and it was just nagging me. And then once I went down that rabbit hole, everything just sort of unraveled, if you would. How was it with you? How did you get started?
Well, I think it was growing up in the 1960s and moving to Northern California from Southern California, where the attitude was completely different. It was totally in tune with all of the stuff coming out of the Bay Area, which of course spread down to Southern California, but it was like the times were different. It was a time of revolution. It was a time of change, and all of the ideas streaming through. And I ended up going to a high school with all of my fellow students were, not all of them, but virtually all of them were the sons of professors. So the intelligence was like out the roof, and the things being discussed were far more sophisticated than what you'd find in a modern day university, as far as the sophistication of political science and that sort of thing. And I was being exposed to it. And in some ways, sometimes I feel like I'm the only one that really took that with me. Not out of passion or belief, but just what I was exposed to. So of course you're learning all about the chicanery going on in the farming industry, because it was a farming university where I was at, the University of Davis, California Davis, and all the political stuff going on. You didn't trust anybody over 30. And I would still tell you that you still shouldn't trust anybody over 30. You have to learn to trust yourself, and of course that was I've never abandoned some of the orientation I got at that time, just on the sheer intelligence quotient of how you look at society. It was like society was a big joke. Another critical point was reading the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey, where he talked about the Combine, which, he didn't call it the establishment, he called it the Combine, and which was alluding to really people being sort of implanted. He was alluding to that, the whole human race being implanted. Then I encountered Robert Heinlein's work, The Puppet Masters, which had that very theme in it, of people being planted with something in the back of their neck, and they were like implanted. And then I ran into L. Ron Hubbard, his work, which was all about mass implantation of human beings. So it's like I've always looked at this society as something that is not as the status quo. So that's kind of when I started, and never. So when I fell into all the stuff I've fallen into with the Montauk Project, it was almost second nature to me. It was second nature to me because it was not. I didn't have to take a leap to understand it or to correlate it. The only thing that was exciting was the fact that I was coming upon information that I'd never heard the likes of, nor had most people.
Wonderful. And I wanted to ask you this too. You brought up Ken Kesey and other people from the 60s. And what do you feel? Because this has been in the air recently, these last few years, even though it's more of a Lyndon LaRouche kind of theory. But the idea that many of our people that were, of course, my idols or teachers like yours, people like Alan Watts or Terence McKenna or again, Ken Kesey and so forth, and were actually compromised by the CIA or were connected by the CIA and were part of the whole MK Ultra experiment. What is your take on this, Peter?
Oh, that is a delightful oversimplification of fact, reading back into history. And this is the oversimplification and assessment of things. Alan Watts, to say one, I had a friend who used to go to his houseboat routinely in Sausalito. I was never interested in Alan Watts, although I did read, a couple of his books, which were helpful at the time. He was a member of the Anglican Church, so he compromised the CIA. He's more like the type of person that would have been instructing them from his hierarchy. But I was not a fan of Alan Watts only because that he committed suicide. Or this is what one of his friends had written about. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but I've listened to some of his lectures in recent times, and they're very cogent. And what he has to say is generally worth listening to for many people. So, I mean, is there a sinister side to Alan Watts? I was never a fan of his. However, in later life, I look back, I said, well, there's some wisdom there. You can say the same thing about Manly P. Hall. A lot of wisdom in what he gives. Is everything he says 100% right now? I don't think that's the case with anybody. Ken Kesey was, he was doing an experiment at Stanford or medical hospital, Menlo Park. I don't know where in the hospital, Menlo Park, Palo Alto area. And he was signed up, but he was being paid to take LSD. He was a guinea pig for a government program. It's not like the CIA was directing him. LSD is a loose cannon in and of itself, and it turned him from a straight person who was a wrestler, conservative type of guy, to this wild day-glow personality. But for all of the wild things that Kesey did, they're tame compared to the raucous behavior of today. I mean, it's mild compared to maybe not the hardcore LSD taking, but so much of the self-expression of those days is almost rather quaint compared to what can go on today.
Agreed.
Yeah, and then I don't know who else you mentioned, but are these?
Yeah, there's Terence McKenna, obviously Timothy Leary. They say was connected to government.
I met both of those people, McKenna and Leary. McKenna I had lunch with. We just happened to be at the same table, and he was a very what do you call it? Loquacious man. I mean, he could talk. He knew how to talk. He was very much preoccupied with psilocybin. And the one thing I've seen about certain lectures, they'll show great sparks in humanity. They'll say, "Oh, this invented." And he would trace it all back to psilocybin. I've seen other people tracing it back to aliens. People have their own hobby horses, and he was definitely addicted, and with people, sometimes when you start taking a substance, whether it be ayahuasca, whether it be psilocybin, mushroom, or any of the weeds or plants, even LSD, you become an advocate for that organism. So you see that when a person is taking a lot of psilocybin and getting enlightenment, you'll see that part of his whole shtick, if you look between the lines, is an advertisement for that particular plant. And the reason for that, it's just like, Democrats want everybody to be Democrats. Republicans want everybody to be Republicans.
True.
The psilocybin mushroom wants everything to be a psilocybin mushroom. So this is where people sometimes get into their little hobby horses. Timothy Leary, interesting story about him. I had met him at a festival in upstate New York. It was a pagan festival. I went there to meet Robert Anton Wilson, who didn't show. Instead, I ended up meeting his partner, Robert Shea, and Timothy Leary, who was the speaker instead of Robert Anton Wilson. And my book had just come out, the Montauk Project. I gave him a copy. He said, "Oh, this is fascinating." He asked me to sign the book. We spoke a bit. I listened to his lecture, and this man could lecture better than a university professor. Well, he was a university professor. He followed all of the, logic, the syllogisms, all these, like, I forget what you call all these different words, Aristotelian logic, and he makes a whole case for showing that, the world is ass up, upside down. And he's right. And he's lecturing it to a bunch of pagans who are ready willing to hear what he has to say anyway. But it was probably 6 months later, I was told that Timothy Leary was speaking in Sacramento at a conference with Preston Nichols. Preston Nichols was my co-author, and I arranged with the person who was doing the organizing for them to meet so that Preston Nichols could meet Timothy Leary. And it didn't happen. And what the word that got back to me from Preston is, he says, "Yeah, I wanted to meet with him, but when he was asked if he wanted to meet me, he says, I don't want to be anywhere near around that guy." Meaning Preston Nichols, who he viewed as a government spook. One spook to another. But Leary was probably the most compromised of all those people. He did work for the CIA, he did work for them. But, again, he's like the what do you call him? The wild card, the thing you can't manage. There's a word for it I'm missing.
Trickster god, perhaps? Loose cannon, yes.
Loose cannon. So, he was and he wasn't. But these are all the signs of the time. This is what I've learned. When you look back on the times, we are all a part of that. We were all part of the Kennedy assassination. We were all part of 9/11. It's just where are we sitting juxtaposed on the 12 signs of the zodiac? This is something that's coming to me, seen clearly late in life. We're all a part of it. So, some of us might be perpetrating certain events, some of us are not, but we're all a part of it.
I would agree. Reminds me of the Rolling Stones song, "Sympathy for the Devil." I shouted out, "Who killed the Kennedys?" And after a while, it was you and me. So.
Yeah, that's a good reference for that. Yes, indeed.
Hey, wait a minute. I was running through my backyard, 9 years old, playing when I heard. I don't remember doing anything.
Well, you're still part of it, Vance. But it's a complicated time. Bill W., the founder of AA, somebody I admire because I'm in the program, he did LSD program. It doesn't mean he was compromised by the government. But again, great to clarify and get your insights, Peter. So why don't we get to the Montauk Project, which many people might not know. I have only studied it here and there. But it's interesting. It reminds me there's a quote in a biography of Philip K. Dick. And Philip K. Dick always said about World War II, he used to say, the Germans lost the war, but the Nazis won it. Isn't that basically what happened, Peter?
That's a very cogent comment by a very cogent observer. You could say that. And of course, Montauk long held a fascination for the German people, going back to the Kaiser Wilhelm. And Montauk was a strategic location for warfare, and the Kaiser was out there building tunnels way back at the beginning of the last century, and so. But it was always a point of interest, and it was a point of interest to the native people, and it's probably important because you have a Gnostic-oriented audience that we sort of summarize the Montauk Project very succinctly And don't get lost in it, because for those who are familiar with the term, the Qliphoth, that negative abyss associated with, Kabbalistic terminology, where all things that don't make it into the stage of life are relegated to, for future reference. If that, Montauk will pull you right into that. It's designed to pull you right into that. And it was a very hard subject to deal with, because it deals with mind control, aspects in astrology that would be ruled or controlled by Pluto, which controls abductions, psychic abilities, and all sorts of things associated with the underground, and coercion. So basically, Montauk was the carry forward of the human factor research done after the Philadelphia experiment, where they were experimenting with radar and invisibility. And all of this stuff is within the framework of science, ordinary science. It's not outside the bounds of it. This can now be demonstrated. And of course, it's a very wild concept, but the problem with invisibility, and when things become invisible, they can be moved in space and time, or they become invisible when they are moved in space and time. And this is done, one of the aspects of this is of making that happen is a rotating electromagnetic field. And there are different ways to do it. The Philadelphia experiment, what they were doing was sort of very experimental and very ahead of its time, but it damaged the people who were involved in those electromagnetic fields. Some of them, bursting on fire, spontaneous combustion, some of them being mentally disoriented or physically compromised by amalgamating themselves into the side of the ship or whatnot. So there was a human factor study at Brookhaven National Labs after World War II, and it was trying to connect the minds of man, see what made it work, connecting it to the early computer, which the first version of the American computer was invented by John von Neumann, who was very involved at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, where Einstein and Kurt Gödel worked. And of course, Einstein was involved with the Philadelphia experiment, if only as a theoretician. So anyway, John von Neumann was heading up this project, connecting the minds of man, and eventually it was brought out to Montauk because they had a huge radar dish out there and a transmitter that was very powerful that emanated transmissions at what was called the radio frequency to the human consciousness, approximately 435 megahertz. So that they were experimenting with people, and they'd put a psychic in a chair, amplify his thoughts, and it would affect the local people, it would affect the local animals. Deer would crash into phone booths or windows. Animal behavior was strange, people's behavior was strange. And that sort of behavior has continued at Montauk ever since. So eventually they were able to harness time, according to the stories and research of Preston Nichols, who passed away last October. And he had very unique theories of time. But the problem that Preston said is that they couldn't get enough power to maintain the portal to go to another place. This was a great big problem to them. Eventually the project came to a climax in 1983, in which he said that himself and Duncan Cameron, who passed away in May, on May 9th, Duncan Cameron was the lead psychic in the project. And he said that, they sabotaged the project, and it had they sabotaged it by Duncan formulating a beast in his mind. And the beast manifested and basically tore apart the project. And it dissipated when Preston torched the electric box and the transmitter. And that was finally how he subdued all that. And the project went to pot. The base was abandoned. It was discovered And Preston, of course, was working on the project, but he had to recover his memories because he didn't have any memory. So much of this has been corroborated. And this was in a new book I released in January. It's called the Montauk Project Silver Anniversary Edition, which is available primarily on Amazon or from skybooks.usa.com. That book corroborates everything that Preston said. It gives certain, it makes everything tangible, real, except for the time travel. That was the one thing we didn't have really good corroboration on from the investigation we made. And the investigation went in two directions. It was a journalistic investigation, which I conducted with Preston. That was a lot of field trips out there. There was also an occult investigation, which I did primarily by myself. But what did happen in 1999, 7 years after the book was published, we had a rather unique man come into one of our monthly meetings that we used to have, and it was Dr. David Anderson. And Dr. David Anderson he had a time travel research center in Long Island where he could slow down or speed up time in a self-contained field about the size of a soccer ball. And that was his research at the time. David became interested in me personally. He asked me to work with him. He put up my first website. He ended up, he wanted to get me to Romania. This was back in 1999. He didn't get me to Romania till 9 years later, which completely changed my life because there's a lot of stuff going on over there that we should probably, I don't know if we're going to only touch on that briefly as well, but David, since that time has, and I've seen a prototype of his early work, which could slow her down. It could make a plant grow in 3 minutes what would normally take 3 days. He did a demonstration of this, or showed us a video demonstration of it in 2010 to me and about 20 other people. So David brought the time factor as something that was possible. All his technology was different than Preston Nichols. It was much more modern, and it solved all the power problems. And you can learn about this, anybody can learn about this technology at the Time Travel Education Center, which demonstrates that time travel is within the bounds of ordinary math and physics. Ordinary. It doesn't require quantum physics. It requires a minimal understanding of algebra and geometry that comes out like the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. You can understand that. You can understand the theories of Dr. David Anderson. And he announced in 2010 that they could put people into that self-contained field and send them back, and that there was also experiments being done in India. They were the most advanced country in the world as far as time research went. He's got his own time research, and that's a whole nother story, but this was the Montauk Project. We're gonna lean back towards Jack Parsons and whatnot, I think, in this interview. And how he fits into it. But that's a summary of the Montauk Project and where it led. And people want to read about it, they can go to skybooks.usa.com or go to Amazon and get the silver anniversary of the Montauk Project Experiments in Time.
Yes, indeed.
Peter?
And,
yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I got a question. The bottom line with the time travel, did they ever determine whether or not there are multiple threads of time, or is there a single thread of time? So, the controversy whether you can change
it's a good question. It's a good question. Preston Nichols in the book gives a theory of time being an infinity of timelines. In other words, every time you change time, you create a new timeline. And you can make a very logical argument that there are an infinity of timelines. And this would represent all potential realities, which is like the fifth dimension, an infinity of timelines. Of course, where you are in your time and where other people are in their time, and the interconnection of the two gets into something called the sixth dimension. I've done a series on that. It's called The Psychology of Space-Time. If you look up The Psychology of Space-Time, Peter Moon, because there's a whole psychology to it, and this is a quantitative approach to psychology as opposed to qualitative. Most psychology is qualitative. This is quantitative, and because it's actually taking dimensions, and it's based upon a mathematical model, which is in the, what do you call it, the landing page for this Psychology of Space-Time, which shows the different dimensions, 10 dimensions. I took somebody else's video, it's not my video, just to demonstrate that. So yes, now Dr. David Anderson says that he has not, as this was when I last spoke to him, he had not encountered the phenomena of parallel universes, but he did believe or accept something called the multiverse. The multiverse is sort of, to me, is a different way of wording it. Physicists get very specifics about their wording. And if you study physics and you have any background at all in hermetics or metaphysics of the 1800s, or even science of the 1800s, words like ether. You see, they'll take a concept like ether, which is a no-no to say in physics, or has been, they're starting to be more accepting of it. They'll reinvent that term, they'll complicate it, but it's still basically ether. And a physicist was once confronted on this, who had a, over academic understanding of things. He said, yeah, that's basically true. Yeah, so they take things and they redefine it, they couch the language and confuse the subject. But I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, that was good. One more before we go on to the next your next topic, which is, during the Montauk experiment, did they ever get information from other creatures or other types of beings other than humans? I mean, they Preston created the monster. Was it Preston, or who was it that created the monster?
It
Duncan.
came out of his id.
Right.
It came out of his id, but that wasn't necessarily an alien per se. There's all sorts of alien stories about Montauk. But the problem, and I published a book, Montauk, the Alien Connection by Stuart Swerdlow, who's like constantly, in conversation with that type of phenomena. Preston would tell stories of aliens.
Interesting.
But see, this is a big problem, because here you're getting into the Qliphoth, what I just said. Alien basically means, and it's interesting, alien and exotic are basically the same word. It's like something from a foreign land, something foreign, something you're not familiar with. And if you study magic at all, it's like you're becoming familiar and refamiliarizing yourself with things that you don't know. There's familiarization and refamiliarization. So when you first hear of an alien or a UFO, wow, what is this? And then if you look at the narrative that human beings steer towards, it goes into sort of a conundrum where nobody figures anything out and everybody's on sort of a daisy chain of going nowhere. And then some people will say, oh, these things are real. I've seen them. I've experienced them. I'm being eaten alive by them, and this sort of thing. And what they don't understand is they're being pulled under by a very negative force. And if you're studying hermetics or anything of that ilk, metaphysics, the alchemists what they taught was to transmute base metals into gold. And this is also a metaphor for transmuting lower into higher. It also has a literal meaning. But I'm saying, and I've said this about 2 or 3 times in messages on Facebook or whatever in the last couple of days. It's a human trait to transmute the higher into the lower. Like, let's take an issue about this character, Jeffrey Epstein, and let's connect the dots to all these other people who aren't even properly charged yet. They're implicated, so the media is going to take it right to the bottom line, or show the dirty underwear of somebody.
Right.
And there's a certain human interest in it, but when it becomes to like subjects that are really of prime importance, it is you know, you got to be careful of transmuting the lower, or the, you know, the higher into the lower, the lowest common denominator, and then some. So that's one of the problems with alien stuff. And I well, go ahead. We go on to the next.
You like spirits, ghosts, and all that stuff.
There's another problem. That's another good example, because you have people into the occult, and they do the same thing. They start, like going to a graveyard and stirring up shit. Do these people want to be stirred up? You know, what are you doing going to a graveyard and stirring up energies? It might not be in your best interest. And certainly, you know, people like that don't even think of asking permission. So, you know, what are you doing? They have a sophomoric interest in the occult, in aliens. And I can only liken it back to, you know, in your teens, if you're looking through into a girl's window with your binoculars, that you might see something that you normally wouldn't see. It's the same thing, only it's applied. It's a sophomoric interest in the paranormal, which is often not in your best interest to pursue in that way. The Sorcerer's Apprentice movie with Mickey Mouse in it is a prime example.
Indeed, well said. And but I guess before we get into the West Coast, and connect this all, why do you think Montauk, which is someplace, what is it, Long Island, has such an interest? It's my experience or research that even if a place is more for scientific, there's always some sort of power and history that attracts or make this happen. I think you're right. What, Crowley was there? I mean, why Montauk? Does it have a history before the Nazis and the time travel?
Very interesting. Yes, very interesting point. Of course, when I heard Montauk, you know, I met Preston Nichols at a conference, or it was rather a gathering, and they were talking about the Philadelphia experiment. The lecture was on Earth changes, and then Montauk kept coming up. Montauk. I said, what's going on? They're talking about Nazis at Montauk, this Montauk Project. That was my initial interest in the subject. Of course, I became fascinated with it, and Montauk became a, you know, I talk about, you know, people hobby horsing psilocybin or whatever drug. I was hobby horsing Montauk. It became the focal point of my life. It took over my life because, you know, I became a publisher because of that book, The Montauk Project, Experiments in Time. And then I was busy writing and publishing books for the next several years, which I've continued to do, but I was a lot more busy and active in it then. And of course, as I began to research Montauk, I mentioned an occult investigation, and Preston Nichols had told me that first thing out of his mouth when I asked him a question was that him and Duncan Cameron in an earlier life were Marcus and Preston Wilson, and they were the first manufacturers of scientific instruments in Great Britain. And so that night, and of course, he said this in the context that the Wilson brothers owned a company with Aleister Crowley's father, who was a brewer, and this company later became EMI Thorn, one of the biggest electronics manufacturing companies in the world. And of course, he said that EMI Thorn was the one that released the movie, The Philadelphia Experiment, in video format.
Wow.
And so that was, I said, oh, because it was supposed to be a court case about it, and, you know, and because the movie was taken out of the screen, out of the cinemas. And I spoke to a woman who had actually seen the premiere of it in Philadelphia, and said they showed a reel of the Philadelphia Experiment, a newsreel of the actual Philadelphia Experiment when they showed the movie. So there was obviously a picture of it, but I've never seen it. So it was taken out, and so who was this mysterious company? So I went home that night, and I had Aleister Crowley. I've been studying Aleister Crowley for the previous couple of years. I had a lot of his books. Because I had just discovered how fascinated and how, what an integral part of L. Ron Hubbard's life Aleister Crowley was. And I had studied with L. Ron Hubbard, so I had a certain, I kind of like had to round out my whole knowledge and experience with L. Ron Hubbard by studying Aleister Crowley. So now I'm being led to the next, basically the career phase of my life, the main career phase. And what I discover is I go into this book, what do they call it? The Confessions of Aleister Crowley, and there's no Wilsons mentioned in it. There is one Wilson mentioned, but it's he's tied to a Masonic lodge in Mexico City, but he's not in the index. There's a Duncan Cameron mentioned. I said, God, his best friend is Duncan Cameron in this chapter. What are the chances of him having a good friend that's Duncan Cameron? I also took notice of the fact that Crowley's real name was Edward Alexander Crowley. And Edward and Alexander Cameron were the first names of the Cameron brothers who were involved with the Philadelphia experiment.
Wow.
So I'm looking for the Wilson brothers. I find the Cameron brothers' name, and I find a Duncan Cameron. Now, these are just synchronicities. Now, this propelled a bunch of other synchronicities around the names Cameron and Wilson, this was the occult investigation. And we're getting back to Montauk Point here. So in any case, I went and I discovered there was a woman who was one of my best friends, Chelsea Floor. I called her Madam X in my book. She passed away a few years ago. And she was like, she knew so much about the occult. And she was fascinated with my experiences, fascinated with me. And she was like, in some respects, a mentor when it came to certain aspects. Now, she had a sister who once, when she met Duncan Cameron, she met him before I did, she had a sister who used to date a man named Cameron Duncan. So there was Duncan Cameron and Karen Duncan, and she'd get the name confused. And of course, I was getting all these synchronicities and I was sharing them with her. And she says, well, I said, you better go find out from your sister what else you can find out about this Cameron Duncan. And she said he had a twin. And I said, find out the twin's name was. The twin's name was Kimberly. He was effeminate, and he loved to study Aleister Crowley, and he loved LSD.
Wow.
So we're back at Psychotronics. We're watching a film. The main character's name, I think it was called Scanners, and it was about one of the main characters' name in this MK Ultra type movie was Cameron, and the girl was named Kimberly. So Duncan walked into that meeting late, and I said, Duncan, did you ever have anybody in your family named Kimberly? He goes, yeah, my sister. So I had like a hot potato of name associations, and they kept brewing and brewing and brewing. But the most dramatic of them all was there was a bookstore in New York City back in those days called The Magical Child. And this is where wizards and warlocks would meet. And of course, they had occult books. And that's why I went there. I did not go to meet with the wizards or the warlocks. And of course, they had the Crowley's OTO, and those people were abundantly there. I didn't associate with them there in that context. But certainly I read some of the literature, some of which was you won't find anywhere else. And what they had a catalog that I had, and it said a release of a new book called Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword, the collected essays of John Whiteside Parsons, edited by his wife, Marjorie.
Mm.
And Marjorie, no, not his wife, Marjorie. It didn't say that. That's her real name, Cameron. It didn't say Marjorie Cameron. It said edited by his wife, Cameron. And I go, what the hell is this? How come somebody has the name Cameron? How come it's related to Jack Parsons? And how come there's no first name? And I said, I knew about Jack Parsons. I learned about Jack Parsons when I worked for L. Ron Hubbard and used to answer his letters. And people would send in these articles, which you'll see printed today, sometimes posted with great fanfare, that Hubbard was involved with the Jack Parsons cult. And of course, I knew that. But didn't know how deeply he was really involved with Crowley until I read the book L. Ron Hubbard, Madman or Messiah, by Bent Corridon and L. Ron Hubbard Jr. And it talked about the Book of the Law, something I had never heard of. So yeah, I went out and got the Book of the Law. I read it, had a lot of synchronicities with that. But the thing was, and of course, so I said, who's this Cameron? So I ended up writing a letter. It took me about 6 months to write the letter because I wrote it and then I didn't send it. I wrote it. It was the person who also assisted the editing, who was more of the grammatical editor. It said Hymenaeus Beta. He was the outer head of the Ordo Templi Orientis. P.O. Box 7666, New York, New York. So I wrote him a long letter explaining who I was, the Philadelphia experiment, why I wanted to meet Cameron. Because I said, you must know where she lives. Can you please help me? I wrote the letter. I put the letter in my mailbox. I took off right after, as soon as I put it in the mailbox, the mailman's coming to pick it up. And I'm flying off in the airport to go to where I came from, Los Angeles, where I originated from, because I live in Long Island now. And when I get to the book fair, I walk into, first thing I see, this is a huge book fair in Anaheim Convention Center. And I run into a huge book of occult books. It's from New Falcon Publications. And there's a man there who's dressed like a biker. He looks like a biker. He said, you know, his name was Alan Miller, also known as Christopher Hyatt, a very famous occult. I mean, I don't know if I knew who the hell he was. I mean, I obviously knew who he was. I don't know how I knew who he was, but I asked him for his help. And he says, yeah, go see so-and-so at the Mystic Fire video. And so I went around and met this guy who knew Cameron. We talked, he was courteous enough to read my book because we're there for several days. And I figured out in talking to him, I said, now I know who you are. I just sent you a letter. He's the outer head of the OTL. I wrote the letter and I meet him in person, 3,000 miles away from where we both lived, because he lived in New York at the time. So that was quite a coincidence. And he was courteous enough to call Cameron on my behalf, who lived in West Hollywood, and she agreed to meet with me. He gave me her phone number, which was ended in 6606. I drove down to West Hollywood, met with her for 4 hours, and a lot of it was listening to her. She was telling me all the stories that people wanted exclusives on from, and she said she didn't talk to them because they didn't respect her or appreciate her. And they were looking for sensationalism. So I not only interviewed her, and I didn't talk too much about that stuff, but I also had her read the book before I published it and got her blessing on it. I even ended up paying her for, every quarter for whatever her contribution was worth. So anyway, I had a very good relations with her in that respect. And I listened to her, and then she listened to me about the Montauk Project, the Philadelphia experiment, and all the associations with the names Wilson and Cameron. And the end, she says, I said, I would have flown out here to meet you personally, but I'm lucky that I happen to be here and that you'll meet with me. But what can you tell me? I don't understand this investigation. She says, well, it's interesting that you mentioned the name Wilson, because my real name is not Cameron. My real name is Wilson. I was adopted by an uncle with the last name of Cameron.
Wow.
And that was like, wow. And she says, and L. Ron Hubbard was also a Wilson. He was not a Hubbard. I said, how do you know that? Where'd you find that out? She says, it's in a book. Sure enough, it was in a book. The book is Barefaced Messiah by Russell Miller. And I had read that book, but it kind of went by me, the Wilson connection, until years later when she tells me. And I said, oh my God, his father, who I did get to see in person, Harry Ross Hubbard, was adopted by the Hubbard family. He was born a Wilson. He was born in Iowa, the same state that Marjorie Cameron was from. And when I went back and told Hymenaeus Beta what I'd found out, he just laughed and said they both come from the same batch, meaning Hubbard and Cameron. They were probably related.
Wow.
Red hair, and both involved in the Babalon working. So that was like, so where does Montauk fit in? So that was like a neat aspect of my story. And then when and it's in the book Montauk Revisited, which goes into that story. Right before I send that book off to the printer, I want to look up the history of Montauk and see if I can find the definition of it. And sure enough, I go to the library and I see a book, Historic Long Island by Rufus Wilson. I said, oh, there's that name Wilson again. Let me pick up the book. I picked up in the book and there was a picture, a plate. This is a book from 1910 and it says the pyramids, Montauk. No explanation of the pyramids. So I asked the librarian, she took me back into a private room where there were some books. And there I found out that the Montauk Indians, they were the royal tribe of Long Island, and their royal family were known as the Pharaohs. And the Pharaohs matched with the pyramids, and that the Montauk Air Force Station, or where it was sacred Native American ground. So it was an ancient, and of course I learned other theories from metaphysical, very deep metaphysical people that told me that Montauk was an ancient Atlantean mountain. And sure enough, the geology beneath Montauk is a mountain. Long Island is like a sandbar that reaches out, but it's not part of the same geology. So maybe that theory is true. And that, of course, the leaders of Atlantis were also identified as pharaohs, according to some theories. So you had a very deep connection with Montauk was a sacred grid point. I was being told this. This is not something I made up or learned, but it was paid a lot of attention to by certain people in the occult field. That's what Montauk's importance is.
Yes, I mean, reading your work, the synchronicities and everything, it's amazing. It's such a rabbit hole. And, of course, your research always comes with some amazing insights. Maybe we could talk about Jack Parsons and how he's related to Montauk. I mean, I went, wow, you were talking about, that you write, Peter, is you say that when they were doing the Babalon work, L. Ron Hubbard and Marjorie and, again, Jack Parsons, that L. Ron Hubbard was sort of the master. He was the one that was running the show. And that sort of goes against the grain of legend.
I wouldn't say that. No, I wouldn't say that. Let me clarify. Is that the Babalon Working, Jack Parsons, he writes in his writings, he says that he didn't have a pet like a cat, so he used Ron as his familiar.
Ah.
So Ron was his familiar. Now, together they were doing their workings, and they were playing sort of like John Dee and Edward Kelly. They'd switch roles. So for a while, Hubbard became the scribe, whereas Jack was the scribe, but Hubbard turned roles around for a little bit. But Jack writes, he says, I didn't have a familiar, so I used Ron as my familiar, which is kind of a impetuous and outrageous thing to do. And did he tell Ron, you're my familiar? And in a sense, you can't say that Hubbard's life did not act out that way. It certainly did in respect to his interaction with me, because if it wasn't for Hubbard and Jack having been assigned him as a familiar in the Babalon Working, I don't know that I would have come upon all this the way I did, because Hubbard was a very strong influence in my life, and a very positive influence in terms of me being able to do what I've done. But keep in mind, the task in dealing with him or his information was what I said earlier about transmuting base metals into gold. There was always somebody around that environment in Scientology who was willing to sell you down the river, and you had to, that's kind of the first thing, you had to have your own guardian energy to protect yourself.
So he was always, I mean, people that surrounded him weren't necessarily on the same page as him. And some of that was because of their own malevolent predispositions, and some of it was just ignorance. And then there were other positive people. So, you can't, it was a very unique experience that I've had, especially when I look back. And the more time that goes by, the more unique the experience was. But so the Babalon Working was being orchestrated by Jack. And he was doing it in, I guess, an unorthodox manner. This subject goes very deep. Next.
And do you think Ron was there as a government plant, or it was his own interest to learn about this? What do you think, Peter?
That's a great question. Well, the standard PR story, and when he told a PR story, this is from his own workings, he says, make it as true as possible. When you say something that's said for public relations purposes, make it as true as possible. That way it'll stick. So his PR story was that he was sent in by naval intelligence to break up a group of black magicians. Now, he did work for naval intelligence, was true. Some people will argue that his involvement in that was very minimal. Others can convince you that it was very substantial. He did, in effect, ruin Jack Parsons financially. He leveled him. So, you can kind of say, and he was introduced to him by Robert Heinlein, who also worked in top classified fields with the Navy. In fact, he worked at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. I have no evidence to suggest he was involved directly in the Philadelphia experiment, or that he knew of it. He might have. And so did Isaac Asimov. He hired Isaac Asimov and L. Sprague de Camp to work at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. And, because he was a science fiction writer, and so were they. And of course, great friend of Hubbard. So Hubbard was living with Heinlein on Lookout Mountain in Los Angeles before he was introduced to Jack Parsons. And he moved from Heinlein's house into Parsons' house. So you can make an argument that he was sent. Douglas Dietrich, who was a research librarian of the Defense Department at the Presidio in San Francisco, he read the files because he was assigned to burn them. And he said that Hubbard was deeply involved in naval intelligence, in psychological operations, and that he read the files, and that they were, and that he was, supposed to burn them. And he has no axe to grind for Hubbard, by the way, at all. And he said that Hubbard answered directly to Crowley. He was actually working for Aleister Crowley. Now, no regular literature is going to say that. They'll say that they never met each other.
Right, yeah.
You can find a YouTube where it'll say that they're quoting Hubbard from a 1952 lecture on the Philadelphia doctorate course, where he says, Aleister Crowley, my very good friend, calls himself the B666. He identifies him as his very good friend. Now, when I first heard that, I thought that he's just, speaking metaphorically, somebody that he either admired or got a kick out of. And he's calling him his very good friend. And talks about the fascinating cults of the Middle Ages in the context of that. So maybe what he said about Crowley there was a little more true. I don't know. It's something that we may never know. But that the tie to Crowley was very strong. And when my opinion is, based upon what I know, a very unique understanding is Hubbard. Well, I've also been watching and reviewing the show on CBS All Access called Strange Angel.
Yeah.
Yeah, and which is a real bastardization of history. However, they're putting certain threads together And when you watch the show, whatever you think of the history of the show, which is very faulty, it demonstrates that Parsons was working at the highest level of the defense of the United States with creating jet propulsion, jet-assisted takeoffs, JATOs they were called. And that's where the Jet Propulsion Laboratory came from. He's creating jets that can help airplanes on aircraft carriers. He was trying to take man to the moon. So you have to understand, the government does not look at that stuff, like they're examining the wherewithal of a ball player or an athlete. They're taking this stuff very seriously. Who Jack Parsons was. So he was always a security risk, according to Cameron, what she told me. He was always looked at. So for Hubbard, who was already a science fiction writer, to go into this climate where you had the top scientists in the world, one of them was Bob Cornog. I met Bob Cornog at Cameron's memorial service. I was introduced to him by one of Jack's best friends, George Fry. And Cornog was the civilian head of the Manhattan Project. And he says, yeah, I remember Ron. He said I said, he was very good with people, right? He says, yeah, he was good with people. Not a scientist, but good with people. And so you have the head of the Manhattan Project, you have all these other scientists, and what is Hubbard doing in the midst of them? Why is he there? This is where science fiction meets reality in those gatherings that they would have. So Hubbard is quite a wild card. It's my opinion that when he got involved in the Babalon working, he might have been there as an agent on behalf of the Navy. Probably was. But he also was an opportunist. And when I say an opportunist, he was an opportunist in the occult level. Because I think the seed of Babylon is in his genes. If you see him and Marjorie, you see their flaming red hair, their energy. They look like, this goes deeper into Celtic stock and the whole heritage of Scotland. Scotland's named after Skoda. She was the daughter of the pharaoh, and that's who Scotland's named after. So there's a whole Egyptian connection to Scotland, just like there's an Egyptian connection to Montauk, because the pharaohs of Montauk, oral tradition is that they came from Egypt. These stories go very deep, and the threads go very deep. And even though some of them are based upon synchronicity, some of the connections are undeniable. But I think Hubbard got involved, and as Cameron told me, he got in over his head in the Babalon working, because after it was over, she said he was completely shaken. Like a little bit of post-traumatic stress disorder from just the occult factors of what was imbibed into him during that. So I think if I could say anything about Hubbard and the Babalon working, I think he was exactly at the right place at the right time as far as where he should be, because it fit his DNA, it fit his makeup, it fit who he was, and it will probably in the future explain more questions about him than anything that he did in Scientology, which I hope to do a book on that in the future when I can get around to it.
Yes, indeed. You've put out a lot of work, and we look forward to having you back on in the future, maybe talk about Romania and everything else, because again, like you said, it's a rabbit hole, but everything starts to make sense, and there is those moments of aha, and of course, hopefully self-knowledge and knowledge, hopefully of a better world like these people work so hard at. But I guess, Vance, thanks for keeping us company on this very fascinating conversation.
And thank you for your questions too, Vance.
Oh, my pleasure. And thanks for all your work, because, we need to uncover what's really going on in the world. It can't just look at business as usual. So thanks for being part of that effort to pull back the covers.
Agreed. Yes, thank you very much, Peter, for coming on Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, and good luck with all your work, and we really appreciate what you've done.
Thank you so much.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. The first part of our interview with Peter Moon. The center surely cannot hold as we get more intense in our second part. In our second part, Peter speculates if there are dark spiritual forces all over the place, that ruling wickedness in high places. He connects the magic of Aleister Crowley with DNA and other sciences, as well as relates the science behind the virgin birth that is the goddess Babalon, as well as the Moonchild. And did either one arrive? Peter then takes a deep dive into the horror of Babalon mythology and explains why L. Ron Hubbard wasn't the villain most people think he was, which then leads us into a discussion of Scientology. Peter speculates on whether Jack Parsons might have been assassinated and opens up a lot about the fascinating individual that was Marjorie Cameron, whom he met, and much, much more. It's a good extra hour of heretical insights. So please become a member of the Archives or patron at Patreon for the full dope. I won't go into much detail here, as I'm tired and emotionally drained from June and July. But there are many rewards, and your help keeps this Red Pill cafeteria open. I can't do it without you, and you can expect more mind-expanding, reality-disbanding content in August and into the fall. Just contact me or go to thegodabovegod.com for means to join or means to help out. Short on shekels? Just message me and I'll give you any show on the Horus House. In the end, I hope all of this helps with your myth-making and removing the lie that is the official narrative of history. I hope it sparks the part of you that deserves to be noticed. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being yourself, your true self. Hello and goodbye as always.